Gibraltar's strategic location has meant that over the years it has enjoyed an importance which is out of all proportion to its size. It is a territory that has been fought over by Moor, Spaniard and Briton. It is a place that has seen many sieges, and it is the 18th century sieges that I'm going to be talking about in this series. Everybody knows that Gibraltar was taken by an Anglo-Dutch force on the 4th of August 1704. But what actually happened on that occasion? Where did the action take place? How did the day unfold? I invite you to walk with me as we explore some of the places that were of particular significance on that fateful occasion. So where did the events of that fateful day begin to unroll? To discover that, we need to go to the top of the rock. This is where the events began to unfold. This is the area where in Spanish times there was a signal station. The signal station was very important because there was a yardarm, and on that yardarm there'd be suspended different signals to indicate where ships were coming from, whether they'd been spied coming down the Mediterranean, whether they were coming across from Ceuta, or whether they were sailing into the bay. And the different number of ships would be indicated on the yardarm. And it was on Friday, the 1st of August 1704, that the Spanish signalman, Joseph Espinosa, saw a detachment of 10 English ships and 10 Dutch ships under the command of Admiral Sir George Rooke sail into the bay and towards the northern end. How do we know about Espinosa? Well, he was one of the Spaniards who stayed behind in 1704. And in fact, he carried on as signalman for the British, and he was paid 1 shilling a day, 5p, which was a reasonable pay in those days, and he continued as signalman until he died in 1727. The detachment of 20 ships that had sailed into the bay was part of a larger fleet of 61 ships. But of course, the Spaniards in Gibraltar at the time didn't know this. What they'd seen was this large number of ships sailing into the bay. And when the inhabitants here in the town saw the signal that Espinosa put up at the top of the rock, they would have gone to various vantage points, perhaps such as this, where they could see over the Spanish seawall and see the bay. And they would have wanted to see the fleet for themselves. And the townsfolk would have been keenly aware that at the time the garrison of Gibraltar consisted of 6 gunners, 30 cavalrymen and 62 infantrymen, a total of fewer than 100 trained men. And that must have been a source of great anxiety. It was here, at the northern end of the bay, that the Anglo-Dutch fleet came to anchor. Why? Well, they had to be out of range of the guns on the fortress. The Anglo-Dutch fleet did not immediately attack Gibraltar. The first part of the strategy was to disembark a large number of troops here on the isthmus. 1,800 troops were disembarked at 3 p.m. on Friday, the 1st of August. They were under the command of Prince George of Hesse-Darmstadt. But this is not what the isthmus looked like in 1704. To get an impression of that, we need to go a little further down the coast. This is what the neutral ground would have looked like in 1704. There was sand, hillocks of sand, there were stands of canes, open space. And there was also the occasional tower, such as the Devil's Tower, which was part of Gibraltar's advanced defences. And there's another tower, similar to that, over here on the headland. When the Marines began to disembark on the isthmus, 50 cavalrymen rode out of Gibraltar through the land port, through here. Now, this wasn't the same land port gate in Spanish times. It was a different gate, but it was in exactly the same location. And what they did was they went out to check what was happening on the isthmus. When they saw that they were so greatly outnumbered, they rode back to the safety of the walls of Gibraltar. And there were 50 Spanish cavalrymen who rode out, yet there were only 30 professional cavalrymen at the time. Now that indicates that 20 Spaniards joined the professionals as a militia. The Marines landed on the isthmus unopposed. Prince George of Hesse then sent in a letter addressed to Don Diego de Salinas, the Spanish governor of Gibraltar. In that letter was an enclosure, another letter, this time one written by Archduke Charles of Austria. He was a claimant to the Spanish throne and supported by the English and the Dutch. The other claimant was Philip of Anjou. Both Philip and Charles were grandnephews of King Charles II of Spain, who had died in 1700, and he had died childless. It was his death that brought on the War of the Spanish Succession. The letter to Salinas from the Archduke Charles called on the people of Gibraltar to rally to his cause and to proclaim Gibraltar in favor of Charles. Now, Charles, by this time, had had himself proclaimed Charles III of Spain in Vienna. The letter of the 5th of May of the Archduke Charles is of particular importance. Note the date, the 5th of May. So this shows that it wasn't a case that in August 1704, on the spur of the moment, the Anglo-Dutch fleet decided to take Gibraltar because they hadn't won a great naval victory or because Cadiz was too strong to take. It was something that had been planned for months. This is where the Spanish town council had its seat in 1704, and it's possible that Salinas was with the council when the letter from the Archduke Charles was delivered. When Salinas read the letter from the Archduke Charles, he chose not to surrender the city of Gibraltar. So the situation at the end of Friday the 1st of August was as follows. Gibraltar was well defended by the castle and by its strong walls such as this, the South Bastion, and the problem was that there were very few professional soldiers to defend it, fewer than 100. So he decided to send for reinforcements to the Captain General of Andalusia, the Marquis of Villadarias. The decision then had to be taken as to whether Gibraltar was to be attacked by land or by sea. Rooke decided that an attack by sea would be the more successful because the land defences were particularly strong, and therefore Rooke decided to attack by sea. The day chosen by him to attack, Saturday the 2nd of August 1704, was a Levanter day. So it meant that Rooke was not able to deploy the ships as he had planned. the opportunity was taken to boost the Spanish garrison. 300 men volunteered to fight alongside the troops. So what you had at that stage was good defences, plenty of guns, sufficient ammunition, but there was a dearth of trained men. At around midnight on Saturday, the 2nd of August 1704, there was a small bombardment. The people of the city of Gibraltar were panic-stricken when the first bombs hit the town, particularly the women and the children. The friars, priests and nuns escorted a number of them here to the southern end of Gibraltar, away from the scene of the bombardment. And they came, some of them, with their clothes. Possibly they thought they weren't going to be able to return to their homes. The people came to pray before the image of Our Lady of Europe, which is still venerated in this chapel today. It's exactly the same image, because this image dates back to the Spanish period. The boulevard marks a part of where the Spanish seawall was in August 1704. And the water came right up to here. There were a number of guns, Spanish guns, mounted all along the seawall. On Sunday, the 3rd of August 1704, Rooke deployed the 10 English warships, the 10 English ships of the line, and they formed a line parallel to the seawall. According to the parish priest, Father Juan Romero de Figueroa, they began their bombardment in earnest at 5 o'clock in the morning. And the intensity of the gunfire was such that the defenders on the wall had to retreat. The next phase of the attack involved 6 Dutch ships. They attacked the Old Mole. The mole we know as the Devil's Tongue. Later, in British times, the Devil's Tongue was extended as far as here, the Old Mole Head. But at the time, in 1704, there had been water on both sides. Next, 6 of the English ships that had been bombarding the line wall moved away, and they came here, towards what the Spanish called the New Mole. Now, the New Mole was later extended in British period and became known as the South Mole, but it was much, much shorter in Spanish times. And there's still a relic of the Spanish period in a small guard turret here on the mole. At the end of the mole was the principal defense. It was a tower which was called La Torre del Tuerto, the Tower of the One-Eyed Man. So what we had at this stage then was a 3-pronged naval attack. The sound of the Anglo-Dutch attack on Gibraltar terrified the townsfolk. Even those who had taken refuge in the shrine, who could hear something of what was going on, but couldn't see what was happening, were terrified. And we actually have an eyewitness account of the attack on Gibraltar. It was written by the parish priest, Father Juan Romero de Figueroa. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Confusion and horror, unspeakable weeping and lamentation, anguish and grief." It shows just what an impact the attack had on the people of Gibraltar. It was here, at the end of the New Mole, that you had La Torre del Tuerto, where the first major turning point of the day occurred. La Torre del Tuerto was designed to provide cover with its guns for the seawall to the south of the city of Gibraltar. So as long as the Torre del Tuerto was intact, it meant that the British could not get close to the seawalls beyond South Bastion. So the British plan was to take La Torre del Tuerto here at the end of the new mole. And the people who led the attack were two English captains, Captain Hicks and Captain Jumper. They jumped ashore and they came and attacked La Torre del Tuerto, which was also being used as a powder magazine. Well, for some reason, the magazine blew up and it created the most enormous blast. When La Torre del Tuerto blew up, a message was sent on the isthmus to Prince George of Hesse, asking him to once again seek the capitulation of the city of Gibraltar. And the explosion, of course, would have been heard even at the shrine. And some of the people who were there decided to come back to the town. And the way to the shrine of Our Lady of Europe in August 1704 was along here. There was no Europa Road in those days, so this was the only path leading up to the Europa area. And the people coming back along here were spotted by English sailors on the ships. So they fired at them, and it made those people turn round and go back to the shrine. And that was to have very serious repercussions later on. With the explosion at the Torre del Tuerto, the battery was put out of action. It meant that the British could now turn their attention on the old Spanish seawall, which was protected by the battery. A section of that original wall, as it was in 1704, can be seen here, opposite the entrance to the naval base. The attention of the British was then turned on a Spanish bastion, which was in this general area, and which was attacked and captured by Captain Jumper and Captain Hicks. The British later rebuilt the bastion and named it Jumper's Bastion. Poor old Captain Hicks never got a look in. Salinas and the town council were now in a quandary. The explosion at the Torre del Tuerto had killed some of the defenders and reduced the already small garrison. In addition, the town had been punished by the intense bombardment from the Anglo-Dutch fleet. Father Juan Romero de Figueroa told us that 28,000 shells were fired at Gibraltar. I think that's probably an exaggeration, but nevertheless, a lot of damage would have been sustained by properties close to the sea wall. The Spanish leaders would have quickly learned that the British had taken Jumper's Bastion and cut off the people in the south. And I think that is what clinched it, because families were now divided and the leadership were going to do anything they could in order to get their families back safe and sound into the city of Gibraltar. Also, the promised reinforcements which had been sought from the Marquis of Villadarias, the Captain General of Andalusia, had not materialized. There was no alternative. Salinas surrendered Gibraltar on the evening of Sunday, the 3rd of August, 1704. On that same day, after the surrender, one of the British admirals, Admiral Byng, arranged for the women and children and those who had taken refuge at the shrine to come here to what we call Charles V Gate, Southport Gate. The Spaniards called it La Puerta Nueva. You can imagine the scenes of joy as families were reunited. That same evening, the doors of Landport were opened to allow Hesse and the troops he had on the isthmus to enter Gibraltar. Salinas had surrendered Gibraltar, but the terms of capitulation had yet to be signed and agreed. That happened the following day, on Monday, the 4th of August, 1704. And there were several terms of capitulation. The first three related to the military garrison. It was provided that within 3 days they had to leave, and they could do so with up to 3 guns. Then there were terms relating to the civilian inhabitants. It was provided that they would have all the rights and privileges that they had enjoyed up to that point, and they would also enjoy the right to freedom of religious worship. But all of this provided that they swore allegiance to the Archduke Charles of Austria, who styled himself King Charles III of Spain. And there were special terms that related to the French. The French, of course, had the Duke of Anjou, the French claimant to the Spanish throne, who was the enemy of King Charles III. So it was provided that any Frenchman who did not leave Gibraltar would become a prisoner of war. Hess then put in place arrangements for the defense of Gibraltar. On the 6th of August, he appointed the first governor of Gibraltar, Henry Nugent. He was an Irishman and had a Spanish title, Conde de Valdesoto, the Count of Valdesoto. But he was not a popular choice with the colonels who commanded the British Marines. Hess had hoped that a large number of Spaniards would remain in Gibraltar and would rally round the cause of Charles of Austria, who had proclaimed himself King Charles III of Spain. This is what happened in Catalonia. But in Gibraltar, things were different. Most of the Spaniards chose to leave, and only about 100 out of 4,000 remained here. There was no La Línea in August 1704. There was no Los Barrios, there was no San Roque, there was no Algeciras. So why did the people decide to leave? A few rich Gibraltarians obviously had property in the surrounding hinterland. They had farms and houses there that they could go to. Some people had family in other towns and villages in the vicinity, so they could go there. But for the vast majority, it meant that they were going to have to leave Gibraltar to camp out in the open. Of course, this happened in August. Had Gibraltar been taken in January or February, then probably it would have been a rather different story. But in August 1704, people chose to go and live out rough, even pregnant women, even the old, the elderly, the infirm, because they could do so. It would have been a different story in the winter. Gibraltar was now in the hands of the Prince of Hesse, and the garrison consisted of English and Dutch forces. So in August 1704, it was not the British flag that flew over Gibraltar, but that of the Prince of Hesse, in the name of the Archduke Charles of Austria, who had proclaimed himself King Charles III of Spain. The attempt by Spain to retake Gibraltar did indeed materialize within 3 weeks. But that is a story that will be told next time.